Black women, can I ask you a question? What's your vision for yourself? Also for black women around the diaspora? These are questions I posed to you this week. I thought about it myself many times what I would like to happen for or with black women. Imagine this, living freely as we are and as who we are, proud of not only our history but the history we're currently making now, as a very special and above average, to poke fun at the late Kevin Samuel's description of us, group of women. No restrictions, no microaggressions, no passive aggressiveness or snide remarks from non-black women. Our voices are always heard, and most importantly, the men in our community stop encouraging us to lower our dating standards to meet them where they're at. Let me tell you about a black woman in history on this rainy Monday where I am, who had a clear vision for us as women. Her name's Paulette Nardal. This name may not mean anything to you. I was once in your position. That said, she for sure is a name for the history books when it comes to black women who were visionaries and worked up until her last breath to shape a future for us. The black woman visionary, Paulette Nardal, October 12th, 1896 to February 16th, 1985. After reading the translated works of the Francophone black woman writer, journalist and editor Beyond Negritude, Essays from Women in the City, 1945, what can be concluded about Paulette Nardal is she was a woman with a conscience and a key, clear morals on how she felt society needed to be reshaped on the Caribbean island of Martinique. Once women were given the right to vote, courtesy of the then French president Charles de Gaulle in 1945. Via her writings for the editorial section of her black woman focused publication, Femmes de la Ville, Women in the City, between 1945 and 1948, in just 14 selected essays that were translated from French to English by T. Denon Sharpley Whiting, I hope I've pronounced her name correctly, we see Paulette Nardal's vision for society, her ideology around the treatment of black people and the lower classes, and most importantly, the liberation of women play out. What she did the year she set up Femmes de la Ville and started to circulate the publication across the Caribbean island of Martinique, once women gained new voting rights in the Caribbean, could be seen as very similar to what her African American equivalent, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, did when she set up the black woman focused publication Woman's Era. This was 51 years before Paulette Nardal created Femmes de la Ville. For example, her first editorial essay she penned for Femmes de la Ville in 1945, just as women across the island gained a tiny amount of liberation, her blueprint is clearly laid out for readers of her journal/newspaper. In her essay titled Woman in the City, January 1945, Paulette made it clear that she saw Christian humanism as the way to cure the ills of society on the Caribbean island at the time. Her message to women was to set about their natural duty as women by embracing Christianity, not in a religious way, but via charity and values, to carry out social work, which she referred to as being in the natural nature of women due to the natural order of things. Paulette, it appears from reading her essay, believed in basic terms that women were there to serve. As a modern woman reading this is not something I'd agree with, women's role and purpose to be to serve. But we can forgive Paulette for her very narrow view and rigid view on the role of a woman due to two things. One, the era she lived in and how limited women were regardless of race. Two, her heavy dependency on religion, which was also another key way of life then that she was born into in 1896. After all, her life's work didn't flourish until the turn of the 20th century. She had a lot of years to be influenced by religion before she stated her campaign to get black women to vote. This stance Paulette had about the role of a woman, natural order, and what women are placed on this earth to do are the only things that modern black women reading her work may disregard. Apart from this, there's plenty we can learn from to unite as women. Old School Black Women's Philosophy for Today's Modern Black Woman. By her fourth editorial essay she published for her journal/newspaper in the spring of 1945, this was around May, Paulette had developed what I would call a long-term plan for Black women across the Caribbean island, almost like an extension to her January writing, which she named Poverty Does Not Wait. Paulette poses the idea of social work within the Black and French Caribbean community. She writes, Martinican women must act, must perform charity, and as a commitment to social action and justice, as a function of fulfilling their duties as both women and citizens, as rational and moral beings. Beyond Negritude, Essays from Women in the City, 1945, page 37. She then goes on to assert that no woman is worthy of the name woman, should remain indifferent to it. This brought many questions to my mind regarding the state of Black women globally. Currently, is Paulette Nardal's vision or her desires via her Women's Assembly she set up and her views on social work being something that can be applied today to the social state of Black women currently across the globe? Personally, on the face of it, I would say and agree, yes, because her encouragement of social work, and I put that in quotations, is something that can be done within the community, meaning social work in the 21st century context for Black women, if we were willing to give it a try and, be as united as a group of women across the diaspora, no matter where each Black woman resides, can be done. How this might look as a starting point for me is if we were to identify what social work, and I put that in quotation, or reform looks like for us. For example, what issues do women who identify as being of African descent in the UK, Canada, Caribbean islands, USA, Ireland, France, wherever, all over the world, what do we face? This could be a starting point and a question posed among Black women, not to overwhelm ourselves at first, but to maximise our chances of success. 3 to 5 commonly experienced key issues Black women face could be brought to the table. By this, I mean our table, not anyone else's, strictly Black women, with no outside influences on what issues we face are key. No taking cues from other groups of women on what a woman's plight looks like today, as this focus is on one demographic of women, Black women only. This could be how our social work, in quotations again, or reform and unity as Black women around the world could start. Using Paulette Nardal's previous viewpoint and vision she had for Black women, this approach would not follow her blueprint on what is or was facing Black women then, or how we should go about managing it, as we're living in a different century to Paulette. It's simply applying her approach of focusing purely on us and having a central place to bring our issues to for wider circulation, which to me, as I read through all 14 essays shared in her translated work, seemed reasonable, regardless of it being written in the first 50 years of the 20th century. As I wrote this, I reflected on if this is why I created the Substack newsletter, Notes on Black Women. I laughed to myself, even though I had created it before I read her work. Was it a calling, to me, knowing that we all face common issues but can be isolated by time, space, and location, even though we are all Black women? I then glanced around the cafe I was sat in writing on that cool but bright Saturday morning. I noticed 10 women, including myself, present among 3 men. Of course, I was the only Black woman at that cafe. The other Black lady departed with her white male companion around 30 minutes ago. The pause was not to notice this, but to reflect on what would need to happen following the identification of Black women's global issues, our organisation, and finding one central base to connect at. If this is to be or was to be an international collaboration, which Paulette did actually attempt. Her newspaper publication, Femme de la Ville, was exactly that central base. It reminded me of the creation of Woman's Era, the first national newspaper published by and for Black women in the USA in 1894, as mentioned earlier, which was created when Paulette herself was just 2 years old, as the central base or news outlet for African American women. In 2024, as I write this, I wonder if this would be an adventurous thing to try to duplicate for Black women. Sure, we have magazines with Black women as a target market, but do we have other news outlets that give a less glamorous and more realistic look at the lives of Black women across the diaspora? Sure, since Josephine's and Paulette's efforts across the Americas and Caribbean islands to provide this and support Black women have definitely been liberated in a way I'm sure both these women would have only dreamed of. That does not mean we don't have work to do or key issues we face now that even fabulous organisations such as UN Women don't address. Paulette's leadership. Paulette was an excellent leader, even in the face of adversity against her publication, circulating news focused on women, their right to vote, and especially the hostility heavy in the air towards Black women in general. This showed in both Essay 2 of Femme de la Ville, Setting the Record Straight, which was penned in February 1945, and Essay 5, Martinician Women and Social Action, which was penned in October 1945. During the first year of operation and circulation of her publication, Paulette came under attack as an early 20th century Black woman advocating for social reform for Black people, and heavily focused on the inclusion and encouragement to vote directed towards Black women on the island that colonisers at the time had set free, in quotations, and at the time had started to recognise, in quotations, as part of the European country of France. Her struggles were hardly a surprise to read about, given the latter. Regardless, our sis, she handled the naysayers with her high intellect, boldness, and frank openness about her dedication to the cause of Black people. I love this. In the face of adversity, Paulette stayed on code for her people, but most importantly for women, and did not let any white person throw her off track as they attacked her vision, idea, plan, publication, and tried to use the slave master's oldest trick in the book, fear. But this time, it wasn't fear of African practices or even African spirituality our ancestors carried with them to not just the Caribbean but to the Americas also. It was fear over what this Black woman could potentially achieve for women. Her potential and efforts were not directed to the delicate little flowers, meaning white women and their docile minds at the time, or their silent compliance with the mistreatment of foremothers of those of Caribbean descent across the island. The white people, especially the men, were shit scared of the rise of Black women, and that's where Paulette put her focus. The mammies for my American friends, or the la madamas for us who are of Caribbean descent, could have been influenced in a way that colonisers didn't want via Paulette Nardal's viewpoints, writing and vision for Black women, who she clearly did not just see as mammies or madamas, regardless of her being born into an upper middle class Black family of Martinique herself. Essay 5, Martinican Women and Social Action, October 1945, clearly shows this and how Paulette calmed the white folk down. She made her and her journal/newspapers political neutral stance very clear. This seemed to work as the publication continued to be published and widely circulated for 6 years across that particular island. That said, by Essay 5 and 6, and now What Are Our Objectives, penned in November 1945, her leadership skills and charisma set in. Her attention turned to the non-believers, or those of no faith. Paulette's approach really resonated with me 79 years to date after she actually penned this essay. In my opinion, as a 21st century reader of her essays, Paulette very clearly, or maybe even strategically on her part, removed the need to be a believer or follower of God to become part of the movement she was creating with her writing, in favour of being a believer in what's morally right to help reform the social ills of the time on the French Caribbean island. This clearly had the potential to engage a wider readership for her publication and women who wanted to be part of the island's new Martinique. In her writing, Paulette's passion for reform shines, her blueprint and vision are clear. In fact, generally speaking, this is one of the most admirable things about not just her work across Martinique for Black people and especially Black women, but also admirable about Paulette herself. She becomes very likeable and relatable, even to someone who was reading her work 79 years at the time of me writing this after Paulette penned it. In closing, as a closer observation about Paulette as a person, she never married or had children. She lived until she was 88 years old. She passed in 1985. To me, this is not very long ago, considering I was born in 1983. I guess as a person, she was married to her cause for Black people, who now had the right to call themselves French, now that France had adopted the island as one of their mainland departments, not an overseas colony. For those unaware, France is a lot like the USA. In every area, it's considered a department, or you could call it a state, and has a postcode attached to it. Martinique's new status meant that it was now part of said departments. This fight for Black people's well-being and the heavy encouragement she gave to women to vote and exercise their rights, and her publication, Femme de la Ville, was her baby. She birthed instead of naturally producing a child, and nurtured this along with the cause for Black people from 1945 for 6 years. Her dedication to uplifting Black women continued once the paper no longer circulated until she died in 1985. A lady never to forget. So back to my opening question. Just as Paulette Nardal had a vision for Black women, what's your vision for us as women? Do you think that Paulette Nardal's idea of social work and reform in a non-religious context could be something that Black women around the diaspora could achieve for us based on our current needs? Let me know with a comment or even in the group chat for Notes on Black Women. And what about your vision for yourself? Have you thought about it? Have a ponder about this, and next Sunday I'll share a free 12-week planner to help you create and shape your own personal vision as we move through 2025. So much love, the Black Woman Essayist.